All right, good morning. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. I know there's lots of sessions going on, so I appreciate you taking the time. So my name is Stuart. Today we're going to be talking about digital maturity in a wholesale organization. I won't be telling you of how to 10x your design practice. Won't be telling you best practices inside Figma. We'll really be focusing on the people and the humans who are actually doing a lot of the work. So today we're going to talk about a journey of small changes in behavior that have started to lead to new business outcomes. So like I said before, my name's Stuart. Everything we're going to be talking about today is the basics and the foundations. Nothing inside this presentation is precious or proprietary to PUMA. It's just one of many different paths that an organization can take to get to an end goal. So a little bit about me and the journey that I've been on so far. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. In my past life, I was an elementary school teacher. I taught kindergarten for 5 years, 4 of them in Hollywood, California. I had the opportunity to go abroad and teach in Seoul, South Korea. And then after the classroom, I found myself kind of navigating this ever-changing world of digital product. So I've spent time as a content designer, a photojournalist, a webmaster, a front-end developer, graphic designer, product manager. I've led digital teams as well as built out design teams. And this is really how my brain works, very similar to the MPK. I take a systems approach to how I build and design and problem solve. Everything is connected across a complex ecosystem. It's really about a series of relationships that rely on communication, connection, trust, and planning. And that extends to teams and organizations as well. And this is one of my favorite books. It's by Austin Kleon, and the book is called Steal Like an Artist. And Austin wrote that book back in 2012. In Austin's book, he talks about a Canadian documentary maker and filmmaker, Kirby Ferguson. And Kirby created a documentary series called Everything is a Remix. And this really resonated with me. And we'll come back to that thread a little bit later on. So that takes me to today. So I've been at PUMA now for 3.5 years, going on 4. I sit at a really interesting intersection of design and brand, creative technology. I lead up our product design team, as well as our design systems and design operations. A lot of the work that I do every single day is around people, community, culture, with a really big focus on design process and really ways of working, because those are the things that are key to pulling off digital products. A little bit about PUMA. So PUMA's been around for over 75 years. It is not a small organization. There's over 20,000 people worldwide who are supporting PUMA in all different parts of the organization. In 2023, there was over $8.5 billion operating revenue. And I say this because PUMA is not a small organization. It is a large enterprise organization. And this is the mantra that PUMA every single day comes to work by: forever, faster. And there's a really interesting duality between the two worlds here. On the forever side of things is the history and the culture and the heritage. But on the faster side of things is the performance, cutting-edge technology, and the culture of firsts. And I think this really sets a really interesting context for the core of PUMA and how it operates. And every single day, PUMA approaches what they do through a lens of sports culture. And that's how it shows up as a sports brand. And by sports culture, I mean what's happening on the basketball court, what's happening on the football pitch. Because those are actually where a lot of the moments are coming. So the fashion and the music that's coming out of the basketball world, the terrace culture in the football space, this is what helps to inform the physical products that are being made at PUMA. So thinking about the past 75 years at PUMA, there is a high maturity in the physical product space. PUMA creates extraordinary product designs for some of the fastest athletes on the planet. And again, this is physical. Those physical products need to be distributed somewhere. And that's why we work with really talented and incredible partners like JD and Foot Locker and Snipes, who are quite critical to the business and who share the same values and business objectives. But when you think about digital products, you're probably thinking more along the lines of the startup scene of the Silicon Valley world. Organizations like Netflix and Apple, Google and Meta. You're probably not thinking about PUMA. And again, that's because the expertise at PUMA for the last 75 years has been in the physical product space. But that doesn't mean that digital products aren't being created at PUMA. It's really on the contrary. Because around the globe, there's over 50 web shops that are operating on 5 different platforms, a fitness and training app, there's a shopping app, kit customizers, and more. And there need to be digital makers who are making these things. So that type of work is happening at PUMA. It's just at the beginning of its journey. And that's why we're talking about digital maturity today. So like I said, we're just at the beginning of our digital journey. And it's a great big challenge. But the really exciting lens of it is there's a plan to get there. So while it might feel chaotic and crazy at the beginning, there's lots of really talented people who are working together to figure out how does that line start to smooth out a bit more. But first, why is it a really big challenge? My opinion is it's a really big challenge because we have a decentralized digital footprint. So around the globe, there's 20+ different regional teams operating 50+ different digital web shops built on 5 different digital platforms. And us as digital makers here, I think you can start to understand where that complexity is. But because we're just at the beginning of that journey, it doesn't necessarily resonate through the entire organization. So how have we started tackling this decentralized digital footprint? One of the first things we did is we talked to folks. And this will be a theme throughout the entire talk today, is actually getting on the ground and talking to the humans who are doing the work. So when we talk to product designers and product engineers, brand folks and marketing folks, the cross-organizational work that's critical to pulling it off. We talked to people who were senior in the organization as well as quite junior, working students, interns, and really wanted to understand what was their day-to-day pain point. If you're building digital products, you were intimate with how it was working, but was it working well? These were some of the topics that surfaced from those listening tours and really fell into 2 high-level buckets, growing edges and things to lean in on. On the growing edges side of things, again, nothing precious to the world of PUMA, but these are challenges that you'll run into in any product organization. Product designers and product engineers weren't necessarily feeling like they were working together. They were reinventing the wheel for every new project. There's a lack of clarity in terms of team capacity. Teams were operating in silos. Again, this is every organization. And you're not going to break down the silos, but figure out where some of these bridges are to connect the different worlds. There was a lack of clarity in terms of roles and responsibilities. But on the things to lean inside, and this is where it gets really exciting, because we have lots of passionate, talented people. People were really keen on that cross-functional, cross-organizational collaboration. People were wanting to work together, but old ways of working and processes were making it challenging to do that. Teams wanted to share their work, as well as teams were really excited about what was coming through the pipeline. What were the new projects? What were the new things that people were getting excited about? So we talked to the people internally at PUMA, but what else was happening kind of in the digital product landscape? So we dove deep into that space, and we started to learn from some of the experts in the community and really take their lead. We dove deep into the product design world, the org design, design systems, design ops, design engineering, product management, product ops, to really better understand what the landscape looked like. Because if we were just at the beginning of that digital journey, these were some of the experts who were starting to chart the course for other organizations, and I wanted to learn from what they were doing. But we also started to look at what large, digitally mature international brands were up to. So we looked at some of our direct and indirect competitors. We took a look at deep engineering organizations like Google and Apple and IBM. We went out beyond the United States and Europe to understand what was happening in places like India and Japan. We dove deep into the world of government organizations because, again, digital products don't exist just in the startup world. Every single sector, every different vertical has a digital product now. We're living in 2024, getting ready to move into 2025. There's a digital touch point against all of them. And these are some of the things that were starting to come out from the digital product community. We were looking at offering menus, org setups, some of the operation side of things. How are we crafting experience for the internal makers? How were teams designed and coordinated and organized? The org design side of things. Taking a look and defining what different roles and responsibilities were. We dove deep into the world of design systems to really understand the different complexities that come into play when you're building digital products. And tying it back into Austin Kleon and his book, Steal Like an Artist, the work that Kirby Ferguson had done in his documentary series around remixing is what I started to do on the PUMA side of things. We were just at the beginning of our digital journey, so how could we start to take some of these things and remix them, what was happening in the community, and bring them to the altitude of where PUMA was in their journey. And this spun off 4 foundational initiatives. None of these were set out to be perfect in the immediate. These were initiatives. And just like designers, we needed to give ourselves permission to really version and iterate on these. They didn't need to be perfect from the start. And as new data points and new insights came in, these initiatives had to be nimble enough to move and be agile. So we'll dive a bit deeper into the 4 different initiatives that are either underway or continuing to roll out through the organization. So number 1, we initiated a design system pilot. We spent time defining product management portfolios, roles and responsibilities, as well as team offering menus. And again, none of this is proprietary to PUMA. This is just the basics and foundations of building digital products. So for our first initiative, we ran an 8-month design system pilot. And at the end of the pilot, the goal was really just to understand, just to learn, really to identify where we would land at the end of 8 months. Because if you pull up PUMA.com, this was the experience that people were running into. So while you might pull up PUMA.com here in Poland, your experience, you wouldn't see this fragmentation. But if you take a horizontal view across the 50 different web shops around the globe, this is what starts to come out. That experience was different in the United States, was different in Singapore, different here in the EU. And as a consumer coming, maybe you don't care about what the buttons look like. But from the business side of things, that means designers and developers are recreating that wheel over and over and over again. And as a business, that's quite expensive. So again, threading it back to the people who are actually doing the work. So for our pilot, it was critical to really set the expectation that product design and product engineering were equal. They were partners inside this journey. It wasn't an engineering-led initiative. It wasn't a design-led initiative. It was a collaborative initiative to make the building of the products easier. And to drive that home, we conducted a series of cross-functional workshops to really better understand what the makers wanted and needed from a design system. And we talked about all of the unsexy stuff, Jira workflows, whether we should take an atomic approach to building components, how wide, how deep we wanted to go with the pilot. And we landed on 3 main pieces. We wanted to build up a pilot version of a component library. We needed some kind of documentation, as well as process for collaboration. One of the core themes that came out of these conversations was the design system needed to be neutral, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. Similar to the country of Switzerland, it would operate as a neutral party. Wasn't leaning heavy into ENG, wasn't leaning heavy into product design. But the lens that we took with it was a service and enablement lane, really to support the other parts of the organization to do their best work. I think one of the important pieces of the design system was we had to treat it like a product. And I intentionally call it a product because it needs to be resourced, loved, funded, and evolved just like you would your product that's consumer-facing. Well, the design system itself might not be consumer-facing to somebody trying to buy a pair of suede. It was internally consumer-facing for the different product people who were making the products. So like I said, the three different parts of that were the component library for both the design side as well as the code side. And the team decided that they would be accountable for all of the documentation. Again, this is a lot of the unsexy, under the iceberg stuff that nobody sees, but is critical to pulling off these types of initiatives. And we landed on a framework: explore, refine, and document. And because this was just a pilot, we really needed to be agile and nimble as we were making. At the time, we weren't sure what budget would be like, if we would continue to have funding. So we wanted to make sure we were bringing the most business impact as fast as possible. So leveraging the Explore, Refine, Document framework, it really helped us to keep our component libraries in sync, allowed us to be agile and nimble, and made sure that we had the tangible documentation to help makers as they were going through their journey. And this is a bit of insight on the workflow. 5 pieces in terms of how this systems team were building. So explore, prototype, implement, test, and document. And this is how we were tackling each component or pattern that was coming into the system. It was critical that we were doing the UI audits and the research and understanding the technical specs in that explore space, because this was setting the foundation, the basics, for what people needed to build. And as we were going through and really identifying the different pain points and improvements we wanted to make, that's where we went into the prototyping phase. It's a lot easier to have a shitty first draft at the very beginning in Figma that you can quickly iterate on than getting all the way to the end of a component build and then not bumping into anybody else who's actually using it. So prototyping and user testing were critical to the process. And then the implement phase, we leaned heavily into Chromatic and Storybook so that we were able to do the visual regression testing as well as building out our Storybook stories and the React components and the Figma components. And then that took us into the testing side of things, because this is where the critical work happened, the QA work happened before it went into a live library for production. And then all the way at the tail end of that is where the document phase ended up happening. And we had light documentation inside Figma, as well as the documentation side that we were building out along the journey. So where did we end up with this 8-month pilot? Nothing groundbreaking, nothing earth-shattering, trying to figure out where did we bring the most potential value to the business. And it was through 23 Figma and React components. We finally had a Jira project and a workflow set up in that space. We had a light documentation site, but I think the most important part was there was an adoption and coverage pipeline that we had built out. And this was really critical, because without that pipeline, none of this would matter. Because once it goes from the library, it needs to get into live production. Otherwise, you've got a beautiful UI kit for both design and engineering. And this is where we've landed today so far. We've got the same component setup. Our toolkit has expanded a little bit from 24 into 70. And I'm sure all 7 of these aren't being used every single day. But because this has been an iterative process, this is where we're able to start going through and refining some of these pieces. We've got a light token set, adoption for both web and app, so it's integrated into multiple products, as well as template and pattern libraries. On initiative number 2, this steps a bit away from the design system world and a bit more into the operation side of things, but really on the product discovery side. That we went and spent time defining what product managers were doing and building out portfolios there. Again, this isn't groundbreaking, this isn't earth-shattering. If you take a look at any other digital organization, any other physical product organization, you already have some of these portfolio management opportunities. And thinking of the remixing side of things, we leaned into the work that Kristen Skinner and Peter Merholtz were doing in their book, Org Design for Design Orgs, and really went deep into how orgs were set up and structured. How were these things resourced? How were the humans put together to actually pull this off? And on the remix side of things, we took the work that they had done and really put them in to a handful of portfolios. And this is just a sampling. There's 5 or 6 other portfolios that currently exist inside the consumer experience journey. But setting them up across the consumer journey and really being mindful and paying attention to where the different consumer touch points were along that journey. Again, nothing groundbreaking, but it just started to build a bit of structure around how we were building digital products. But it also gave our regional teams, counterparts on the global side of things, to have some of those intentional conversations. I think one of the key learnings from this was it also started to create a bit of structure and a framework for how we could integrate and talk to some of our business leaders and business stakeholders. What had traditionally been a really complex ecosystem of all of this work that had to happen, but it was never necessarily a human to touch and have that conversation with, and now there was somebody driving that. So on the e-commerce side, really paying attention to what that journey looked like, where were the consumer touch points, who was accountable, but who was also driving some of that space there. So things like search, homepage, navigation, POP filters was what we were calling the discovery portfolio. This is how people were starting to find the product. If you were on PUMA.com, these were the people who were there. On the convert side of things, we start moving a little bit further down that funnel, was the PDP, ratings and reviews, virtual try-on, size guides. These were where people were going, exploring, understanding a bit more of the product, and we're getting ready to move into the purchasing journey a bit deeper. And then that checkout side of things, nothing sexy, but is where we start kind of diving deep into there, because this is where intentionality really matters. You've got somebody further down that journey, and they're ready to pull the trigger or to purchase that pair of shoes. You want to make sure that there's a frictionless experience there. Another part of this initiative was on the product discovery side of things. So we leaned in heavily to Jira product discovery and just started to map out a bit of how the different portfolios and ideas were coming into play. So the same portfolios that we looked at earlier, ideas from the product discovery side of things started to flow into them. Product managers now had something tangible to be able to say, these are the levers that we could be pulling to prioritize. We mapped them out against KPIs, who the requesting regions were, and also leveraged an internal value calculator to be able to better understand what the business impact of some of those things were. And nothing major changed on here, but we added in some of these green badges as we were talking to internal consumers of this information. And we started to map out effort and impact, and where did we see the most business value coming from. So if there were what felt like critically important regional projects that were happening, but didn't necessarily move the needle across for the larger global organization, maybe that wasn't the main priority to be working on. And again, just creating a bit of structure and focus for people who were actually building and working. The third initiative that we spent time really going deep on was understanding roles and responsibilities and how are we mapping them. I love this slide, but from an information architecture perspective, this is really overwhelming. There's a lot of information there. And if I were to share this with one of my business stakeholders, they would probably cry and leave the room or tell me to piss off. So we really had to figure out a way to synthesize all of this really rich information and get it into one place. So this is just a screenshot, a slice from Jesse James Garrett's book, Elements of User Experience. And Jesse goes in and dives deep into the different areas of the product stack that we need product people to focus on as they're building. So rather than clumping a UX and UI designer into the same role, we needed to split that out. UX was focusing on a different part of the design process than UI was focusing on. So we sliced up the roles a bit and simplified this incredible yet quite complex slide. So this slide itself is taken out of context a bit. It's part of a larger deck that we leverage inside internally to talk about things. But this started to create a bit of structure and context around roles and responsibilities and where the humans who were making the product should be focusing their efforts. So if we take a look at kind of how it stacked up, the product managers would be spending a lot of their time in that scope and strategy space. Things like functional specifications, content requirements, user needs, site objectives, while a bit more abstract were critical foundational pieces to understanding how do we build on top of that. In the green space here, this is where we would spend a lot of time with our UX designers. Information architecture was happening in this space. It becomes a bit more tangible. You can start to touch it and see it and feel it a little bit more. Where down here, it was a bit more ambiguous. So the skeleton and the structure, these were the pieces that we were then able to start taking to different stakeholders and having conversations around wireframes. Not necessarily final designs, but here's the shapes and containers we needed to start building on top of. And this is where that design lane was spending its time. And then up on the surface side of things, this was the UI and the design system space. It's not fair to say we're just putting a layer of paint on top of all of the work that's happened below, because there's a lot of critical work in the visual design world. But this is how we were stacking it up and kind of conveying that complex slide from earlier in a much more simplified and digestible way. So remixing what Jesse had done and translating it into what would resonate in the world of PUMA. And one of the last initiatives that we spent time in was around our team offering menu. So this is a screenshot from Brennan Hartrich. He used to work at Intuit. He was in the design ops space for a really long time. And Brennan gave a talk around design ops and kind of at a larger global conference. And on the ops side of things, it was really important because this starts to convey information. This starts to map out different areas that from the ops side, they could be supporting their product leaders on the design side of things. So creating intentionality around the different lanes or the different areas that people would be working was part of that information architecture work that needed to happen. And then we remixed it. We put it into a bit of context on the PUMA side of things. So with the lens of consumer experience, figuring out how do we partner with other parts of the larger organization. And we broke it into 3 buckets: the product, process, and people side of things. On the product side, like we talked about earlier on the design system, we really had to create a governance plan around that. And that's continually evolving. Also setting up meeting cadences for things like critique and design reviews, and the unsexy work of having to be the administrator for Figma, going through and toggling the different permissions in there, making sure that we're connected with the financial team as well as with legal team. On the process side of things, this is where the critical work happens. Supporting with OKR definition, managing budget, procuring new tools for the design system, as well as the rest of the designers on the team. But really what's also a communication strategy, trying to figure out how we can proactively communicate to our external partners what's happening internally inside the design practice. And then on the people side of things, the community building, I feel like I've said it a few times, is where the critical work happens. I think as designers, we spend a lot of time with our precious design artifact. But if we're not necessarily building out the relationship in the community, it's just an artifact. And until it goes into production, it really doesn't matter. It's just a beautiful digital artifact. So building out this community and relationships was critical. The mentorship side, learning and development, how are we making sure that designers were getting what they needed to continue to grow in the world? So let's summarize it, bring it back a little bit. Everything we talked about today is just the basics and foundations. My past director would say this a lot, but we were spending a lot of our time getting the house in order. While the house isn't necessarily tidy and ready to go, it's got a lot more structure to it. And that's part of the iterative process, is we're continuing to do that work and making sure that we've got the space for people to be able to come and build on top of. So while it might feel like Sisyphus rolling the ball up the hill and continually having it roll back down, and you having to say that exact same story over and over again, or walk another stakeholder through another comp and explain to them why consumer experience, user experience, any of the different experiences matter, that's the important work. That's the relationship building. And if there's one thing that I can say today, is just to remember that it's a marathon and not a sprint. You don't have to be the first one at the end of the line. It's the consistency, coming to work every single day. It's the small, iterative steps that ladder up to something much larger, whether it's in the design ops lane, your design org, your product org, or the larger business. Small steps to get you to the next spot along the journey. And with that, I say thank you.
Let's once again show our gratitude to Stuart Wainstock with a round of applause. Now we have some time for a Q&A session. And if you have any questions to Stuart, now is the time to ask them. And I got one from chat, which we'll use as a starter. A question from Natalia. How are you dealing with new components and changes in existing components when projects which are using your design system are already using certain version but have to make an upgrade to latest one? Is there any situation when upgraded, corrected component is having negative impact on the working product?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I think I was having a conversation the other day, and I think one of the lenses that I really use for the design system is really pay attention to the core, keep the core of the system healthy, and the other pieces of that will follow. Yes, there might be impact, but if we're paying attention to the core, then the variations or the deviations can exist. So if we go back a couple of slides in the conversation, it's really around the communication strategies, being proactive in approaching how we were communicating this to other product designers. So if we didn't have the communication paths forward, they wouldn't necessarily know that there was a library update or a breaking change. So when a breaking change ends up happening, we go into a period of hypercare. So a new library update takes place, and there's a handful of folks on the system side of things who are supporting some of those breaking changes, getting files back up to speed, making sure that the QA is on point, so by the time it does go into production, hopefully some of those breaking changes are minimal.
Thank you. And do you have any questions from the audience? Yeah, I got one coming right to you.
Okay, so the thing that I was very interested about, the documentation, was the last part of the process, and before it, you were doing the development. How you were doing the development?
Yeah, good question. Well, it might be mapped out as the last part of the process. That documentation was continual.
Okay.
So the teams were working together, and we didn't necessarily have a final documentation ready, but there was light documentation happening throughout the entire period.
Okay, so the finish line was after the testing.
Yep.
And second bonus question, how many designers were involved in the 8-month start of the design system?
Yeah, so it was a relatively small team, and still is a small team. So there were 2 product designers dedicated purely to the design system stream, as well as 2 product engineers. And then myself as kind of a product manager of the stream, so a total of 5.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm waiting for any other questions from the audience. Yeah, got one.
Hey, Stuart.
Hey.
Thank you for this beautiful presentation. Your role involves a lot of showing the direction to your team and managing the business guys, like the C-level people, and managing the change of the organization. But do you still make your hands dirty? Do you design at all still?
Yeah, good question. Less and less, but yeah, hands are definitely dirty in Figma. We was just working through a project the other day where resources had already been allocated to other places, so the makers were already doing the work, but we still needed to work closely with our European team to actually build out some specs and comps for something. So having to go back through and kind of switch gears a bit and get my hands back dirty in Figma was really exciting, but at the same time, helped to shine a light on how quickly Figma as a tool continues to change and evolve, and how important it is to have your hands dirty while you're in there doing that work. So not nearly enough, but it's nice to be able to get back in the tool, absolutely.
And I got a question from myself. I wonder, was it hard to find time in such a large organization to implement a complex design system in already existing product?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Absolutely. That's one of the biggest challenges. It is such a complex setup of digital products, and really being mindful of where are the most important or highest business value components that can be integrated into the larger project or products. So Could we be doing more? Absolutely. But really finding where some of the business critical impact was kind of how we set that direction or mantra to be able to go into. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We still have some time to squeeze in some questions from the audience, and I already see one.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the involvement of the people who were the touch points with the client on their journey? How did it look like, and the collaboration model, how it worked out?
Yeah, good question. Are you referring more to some of the workshops and conversations that were going on? Yeah. So really, it was a lot of the facilitation, and I think one of the areas that comes natural to me, kind of having an education background, was needing to be able to facilitate and bring in those cross-functional stakeholders into that conversation. So while they're not 5- and 6-year-olds, they're adults, getting them inside the same room and kind of helping to set up kind of structure around some of those conversations. The cross-organizational, cross-functional was the critical part, because as a designer, my assumption is this is how this component should work. But you quickly add in engineering, you quickly add in product marketing, and those types of things come to life in a very different way. So really the cross-functionality of that, but then also the intentional facilitation of conversations. The setting up some of the structure for that in whether it's FigJam or whether it's Miro, and having some of those collaborative conversations, the setup was the hard part. The easy part is once you've got folks inside the room, conversations start naturally, that people are wanting to contribute into that and really wanting to build out what could be the best kind of possible product possible.
And at which level were they involved in the actual component review?
Yeah, good question. So the very beginning was a larger all-hands kind of session, and maybe all hands is the wrong word, but really having leads involved for some of those more critical conversations. And then it would almost be a ping pong back and forth. So then it would go into the design system stream a bit more, and we'd start to go through some of that iterative process, really understanding the research on the components. And then there would be another kind of regroup after some of the prototypes have kind of started to come into focus. And then we would do a regroup and have those conversations with cross-functional stakeholders. And then would come back into the system stream again. So it was really a back and forth and being as proactive around communication as possible, which was another challenge along the way, is really over-communicating. But that's where we found a nice kind of sweet spot from some of that success.
Thank you for the question and the answer. And we still have time to fit in one more final question. And yeah, I'm coming right to you.
Hi. So I know that the design ops is still like a growing part of the product, but I wanted to ask you, how do you see the future of design ops? And I know that it might be a long, conversation, but just like a few words about that. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. I think the ops space is well, it might feel like it's new to the larger design stack or the larger product stack. I think is a critical piece and continues to become an even more important part of that kind of product landscape. That's why you start to see some of the emergence around product ops, as well as kind of creative ops and some of the more opsy kind of things. So as a designer, if you're hands dirty in a tool, it's absolutely applicable to be able to move over into the ops space. And vice versa. You can move back and forth in between those areas. So I think we'll start to see a lot more cross-pollination of worlds coming in there and kind of helping to set structure, best practices, ways of working that really empower the people who are then getting their hands dirty in the enablement side of things.